Okay, so why do we discount the situations? That's the nature of this fundamental attribution error, that we are overestimating the dispositional factors and underestimating the situational factors. And why do we do that? There are a couple ways to look at this, and the first one will be the following, that the idea is that it's difficult to see sometimes the situational factors that are affecting behavior, right? Now here's a quote from a book by Sam Summers called Situations Matter. He's a psychologist who studies these and other issues. Most of our daily existence takes place in familiar environments within the confines of well-worn routine. It takes the jolt of the unfamiliar to remind you just how blind you are to your regular surroundings. So again, the idea is that there may be situational factors influencing our own and others' behaviors that we just don't notice, right, very well, unless something changes or somebody calls our attention to it. We can, in a cartoon way, show that in the following way. So here's our brain, here we are, and we're observing the world, and here's some behavior out here, right? So we see the behavior. The idea is that it's very easy when we see people acting in the social world, it's easy for us to make a dispositional attribution, to think that their behavior corresponds to their internal attributes, their personalities, their values, and so on. And symbolically here, the word situation is written here in a way difficult to see. So the first pass at understanding why we might make the fundamental attribution error is that is the salience of the situation is low. Situations are hard to see. Right. Now think about just an example, poverty. Right. So here's a poor person. Here we are looking on at poverty. Well, the dispositional attribution would take the following form. Right. We might have some stereotypes or in our brains, and it's easy for us to attribute maybe just a laziness or poor moral character or low IQ or these would be dispositional attributions to explain the condition of poverty for this individual. The situational factors might be more difficult to see. The lack of opportunity, the social forces at play, right? We don't see that when we just see an individual, a poor individual. We don't see all these types of things. They're happening in other places and at different times, right? Luck could be a factor in whether this person is poor or not. And those things are difficult to see. So the first explanation for the fundamental attribution error is the idea that situations are difficult to see, and that leaves dispositional factors more easily accessible. Here's an example taken from the origins of hip-hop. Now, hip-hop had its origins in the Bronx environment. It was a tough environment. So here's a highway going through the Bronx. That was part of what got people really up in arms, right? The city planners started to build highways right through the neighborhoods, and people felt powerless and so on, and it kind of divided the community, and then there was crime and joblessness and so on. There are all kinds of situational factors going on there. And so if we're looking in from the outside, right, and we see violence in the inner city in the South Bronx, well, if the fundamental attribution error is happening as we make attributions here, we're going to make an easy dispositional attribution here. These violent people, right? That would be the dispositional attribution. We look upon this violence and we make a dispositional attribution that they are violent people. That's why we're seeing this behavior. What might be harder to see are all those environmental situations, all of the situational factors that are at play, that may be causally related to this increased violence in these neighborhoods. By the way, and we'll come back to this again, from the actor's point of view, right, they're going to tell us, well, I was forced by my environment, right? So we're going to see that situational factors can be seen by actors themselves. They're very salient to the actors themselves. We'll come back to that point in a minute. But for the onlooker, if we're making the attribution error, then we're going to just make a quick dispositional attribution here. We'll be more likely to see this as a dispositional behavior. These are violent people. And we're going to miss some of the hard to see situational factors related to the behavior. Now, making attributions has definite political implications, right? I mean, if we look upon this scenario here and we make a dispositional attribution that they're violent, well, then that might recommend certain public policy measures, like we got to take the violent people off the streets, get them in jail. But if we see the violence as related to situational factors, well, that might recommend a different policy that, let's invest in the neighborhood, let's make improvements, right? Let's change the situational factors so that this behavior is less common. So how we make attributions has political implications. All right, that gets us to our second way of understanding the fundamental attribution error. So the first was the salience of the situations, low salience for the situations, they're hard to see. The second type of explanation is that the fundamental attribution error is the result of a failure in a certain cognitive process. So here's the idea. When we look at some behavior, right, we first make an automatic dispositional attribution. So we see the behavior, and then we've got brain systems that quickly make a dispositional attribution, that this person's behavior is corresponding to their dispositions, to their internal personality and values and so on, that we see what we see is what we're getting, right? And then the idea is if we have the time and the energy and the cognitive resources, we can make a correction for situational factors, but this correction might fail, right? So we make an immediate kind of automatic dispositional attribution, and then we simply fail to make corrections for situational factors because that correction takes extra cognitive effort, right? Now we're going to bring in our distinction between automatic and controlled processes. So the way psychologists think about this is that the automatic process, of course, is happening first, and it's the dispositional attribution, but the correction for the situational factors is a controlled process, right? And so that's going to take more time, and that will be our sort of a more controlled and possibly accessible to consciousness, right? And a slower process, right? Typical of the controlled processes. We have conscious access to this. They're slower, they're serial in nature, we're conscious of them. And so whatever correction we make here, then that'll be our final attribution. But if we fail to make the situational correction, we're going to be left with a dispositional attribution. So again, here we are looking at some bad behavior, right? We got the person who has these internal attributes like personality and moral character and values and so on, and then we got situational factors that might be influencing behavior. So the error, the nature of the error would be that we all sort of make an automatic dispositional attribution. I say we all, we're going to qualify that in a moment. So we make automatic dispositional that that's a bad person. If we see bad behavior, we say that's a bad person. That's a dispositional attribution. And then we make a controlled correction for situational factors, right? Maybe there is some situation that maybe they had a gun to their head, right? Or there's some other situational factor that we can learn or that we can see if we pay attention, or we can discover it or whatever, and then we make a correction. Maybe they had no other choice. So if we make that correction, we'll conclude, no, they're not a bad person. Rather, the situation was forcing them to do this bad behavior. But you see, if that controlled correction fails, then you're left with a dispositional attribution. And again, the finding in Western social psychology research, for the last 40 years, was that we have a tendency to not sufficiently correct for situational factors, and that's what's called the fundamental attribution error. Now, let's do two more examples of how this might work. So imagine you're on a plane, and maybe this was soon after 9/11, right? So people were very nervous when they were getting on planes. Now imagine a Muslim-looking gentleman is sort of running to the plane with a backpack, right? And they're sweating and so on. And we can imagine that the passengers on the plane here might have had an automatic fear response, right? Oh my goodness, a terrorist, is getting on the plane, right? Well, if they were able to, of course, they could have made a controlled correction that no, this is not necessarily the case. Really what happened was this is a perfectly innocent individual who was just late for the plane, right? But you can see, though, how the automatic processes can really drive behavior. If we fail to make controlled corrections for these automatic processes, then we're going to be left with whatever the automatic processes generate. And this is similar to a non-social example. When we're out on the path, we're hiking or whatever, and we hear some rustling in the bushes or something, some of us might automatically just kind of jump. We have a quick fear response. Oh no, it's a snake, right? Oh, and then we look over and we see that it was the wind just kind of blowing the leaves around, and so we make a controlled correction. Right? So again, this distinction between automatic and controlled, then, it applies in non-social situations, but it can also then, it shows up in social psychology, where we are making attributions about the behavior of others. And if we don't control, if we don't make corrections for our automatic attributions, we're left with the automatic process. So the fundamental attribution error produces a biased view of human nature. By overlooking situations, we have an oversimplified picture of human nature, that what we see is what we get. And this is the little lesson of Sam Summers' chapter on the attribution theory. We are more comfortable seeing others in the same way we watch sitcoms, where stable characters act the same way wherever they are. So in days gone by, if you ever had watched Seinfeld, right? So you got the character of Kramer, and Kramer is going to be Kramer no matter where you put Kramer. And a lot of TV characters that way, they just have these characteristics and attributes and personalities and so on, and that's part of the fun of these comedies. You can stick these crazy people in different situations, but they're still going to be the same old crazy people. And psychologists are arguing that this attribution error is sort of like this tendency to just see people as these creatures that have these internal attributes, and it's easy for us to read all of their behavior as though it's issuing from their internal characteristics. Well, what are some advantages? Let's think about that. If we're making these errors, discounting the situation, what might be the advantage to doing that? If we have evolved our psychology over millions of years, right? Maybe there is something to it. Well, here are some possibilities. We don't want to recognize the power of situations, right? We don't want to, right? We might be motivated to not make the correction for situational factors. So making dispositional attributions gives us the feeling that the world is more predictable, so we feel more in control, right? So maybe it's a little bit a greater feeling of control if we think of people as having these internal attributes that don't change, and then we'll feel like the world is going to be a little more predictable, because if we know these people, we'll know they'll behave in a certain way in different situations. It's tempting to see bad behavior by others as dispositional, since this makes the self appear better by comparison, right? So if I see somebody else doing bad behavior, it's kind of in my interest to make a dispositional attribution, because then I can say, yeah, look at that bad person relative to me, right? I'm the good person, but look at that person over there doing something bad. They're a bad person. Finally, it's tempting to see our own good behavior as dispositional, since this allows us to take more personal credit for success, right? So when we're doing something good, we're going to focus on our dispositions, our internal attributes that are related to the good behavior. We're going to discount situational factors, because those would be things that we can't take credit for, right? So in summary then, the fundamental attribution error, we can a couple of summary points here. Situations are hard to see. We might be motivated to not correct for the situation. Another way to look at it is from a cognitive point of view, that a two-step process is happening. So the error is the result of the fact that we make an automatic dispositional attribution, but then we might fail to make the controlled adjustment for the situation. And finally, there are some cultural differences that we'll take a look at in a future lesson. Finally, when do we see the power of situations? And we saw this earlier, when we are the actor, right? We are consciously aware of the situational factors in a way that when we're observing.